By the final days of January 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Across the Western Front, exhausted German divisions were being driven backward through snow-covered forests, shattered villages, and frozen farmland. Hitler's last major counteroffensive in the Ardennes had failed catastrophically. Thousands of German soldiers had been lost for almost nothing, and now Allied armies were advancing relentlessly toward the borders of Germany itself. Every road leading east seemed filled with retreating vehicles, wounded men, abandoned equipment, and civilians fleeing the approaching war. Entire towns burned under artillery fire while the skies above Europe belonged almost entirely to Allied aircraft. The once unstoppable German war machine was running out of fuel, ammunition, manpower, and time. Yet despite the disaster unfolding around them, the Germans still held one final strong defensive position inside France. The Colmar Pocket. Stretching along the Rhine River near the French-German border, it remained one of the last major Nazi footholds west of the Rhine. Its bridges and supply routes were critically important, and German commanders understood that losing the pocket would leave the road into southern Germany dangerously exposed. So they decided to fight for it. Not cautiously. Not defensively. But with desperate violence. Throughout January 1945, German forces launched repeated counterattacks through the icy countryside surrounding the villages and forests near Colmar. Tanks rolled through blizzards. Infantry marched across frozen fields beneath artillery fire. Entire units fought knowing the war was almost certainly lost, yet still obeyed orders to hold the line at all costs. And in the middle of this nightmare stood a 19-year-old American officer named Audie Murphy. What happened to him on January 26, 1945, outside the tiny village of Holzwihr would become one of the most extraordinary acts of battlefield courage in modern military history. The battlefield itself looked almost cinematic. Snow covered the fields in every direction. Bare winter trees stretched like black skeletons against a gray sky. Smoke drifted low across the ground while distant artillery flashes illuminated the horizon. Every sound carried through the freezing air, the rumble of engines, the crack of rifles, the metallic echo of tank tracks crushing frozen earth. The war in Europe was entering its final chapter. But for the men fighting there, survival still came down to the next hour. By early 1945, Audie Murphy was already becoming famous within the American Army. Stories about him spread from regiment to regiment, stories of impossible assaults, destroyed machine gun nests, captured Germans, close-range firefights, and miraculous survival. Yet Murphy hardly looked like the type of man soldiers imagined when they thought of a war hero. Born in rural Texas in 1925, he came from a desperately poor farming family. His childhood was shaped by poverty, hard labor, and instability. By the time he reached his teenage years, Murphy had already learned what it meant to survive with almost nothing. Physically, he appeared entirely unsuited for war. When he enlisted in the U.S. Army underage in June 1942 at only 17 years old, his medical records listed him at just 5 feet 4 inches tall and barely 112 pounds. Thin, quiet, and youthful-looking, he appeared more like a schoolboy than an infantryman preparing for combat. During training, other soldiers jokingly called him "baby." No one laughed later. Behind Murphy's small frame was an almost frightening level of determination. He possessed sharp instincts, remarkable accuracy with weapons, and perhaps most importantly, an absolute refusal to quit once fighting began. After arriving in North Africa in February 1943, Murphy joined Company B of the veteran 15th Infantry Regiment. Officers quickly noticed his aggressive style in combat and his willingness to volunteer for dangerous missions others avoided. His first major combat experience came during the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Landing near Licata, Murphy entered the brutal reality of frontline warfare for the first time, machine gun fire ripping through beaches, artillery shells exploding across hillsides, and exhausted soldiers advancing village by village under constant threat of death. Most men needed time to adjust to combat. Murphy seemed drawn toward it. He constantly searched for action, often moving toward the heaviest fighting instead of away from it. By late July he had already earned promotion to corporal. At Salerno, Murphy charged and destroyed a German machine gun position by himself after it pinned down his platoon. Months later, during the savage fighting at Anzio, he destroyed a German tank and helped stop an enemy attack, earning the Bronze Star. Again and again Murphy demonstrated something unusual. Fear affected him differently. While other men froze under fire, Murphy appeared to become calmer and more focused. Veterans later recalled how quickly he reacted during ambushes and how aggressively he attacked enemy positions even under overwhelming fire. But the war was grinding him down physically. Murphy suffered repeated illnesses during the Italian campaign, yet he almost always refused evacuation. On one occasion medics reportedly had to physically drag him away from the front line because he refused to leave voluntarily. Even then, he soon returned. By August 1944 Murphy was back in combat during Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France. During the fighting he killed 2 German snipers and independently destroyed another machine gun nest, earning the Distinguished Service Cross. Then came October 1944. Within just 3 days, Murphy earned 2 Silver Stars after repeatedly fighting through German ambushes and personally killing or capturing numerous enemy soldiers. His actions became so extraordinary that he received a rare battlefield commission. But his success carried severe consequences. A sniper's bullet tore into his hip during combat, leading to gangrene and forcing him into months of hospitalization. Most soldiers would have remained safely away from the front after such injuries. Murphy did the opposite. He discharged himself from the hospital early and returned to active combat. So by January 1945, 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy, unbelievably still only 19 years old, found himself leading the battered remnants of Company B near the Colmar pocket. The unit had been devastated. Days of intense fighting reduced Company B from over 100 men to roughly 40 exhausted survivors. Many were wounded. Most were physically drained. Nearly all had lost close friends during the previous weeks. And Murphy, once a private in the very same company, was now their commander. The American line near Holzwihr was dangerously exposed. The frozen terrain offered almost no protection. Digging defensive positions proved nearly impossible because the ground had hardened like concrete beneath the winter cold. Soldiers paced continuously in the snow simply to keep their feet from freezing. Murphy later described the battlefield in vivid detail. A rough U-shaped forest stretched toward the village. Beyond the trees lay flat open fields covered in white snow. Far ahead stood the rooftops and church towers of Holzwihr beneath a dull winter sky. A narrow road passed through the woods directly toward the village. Today, historians using modern mapping technology have identified the battlefield almost exactly from Murphy's descriptions. It was there, along that frozen tree line, that Murphy and his 40 men prepared for what was coming. Supporting them were 2 M10 tank destroyers positioned near the road leading toward Holzwihr. Murphy established his command post inside a drainage ditch near the rear tank destroyer. His equipment was minimal. An M1 carbine. A field telephone. A map. Binoculars. And the responsibility for keeping his remaining men alive. Murphy fully understood how vulnerable their position was. German forces still controlled parts of Holzwihr only a few hundred yards away. Reinforcements for Company B remained nearly a mile behind them waiting for fresh units before advancing. If the Germans attacked with armor, Murphy knew his company could easily be overrun. Expecting exactly that, he ordered preparations for a secondary defensive line deeper inside the woods where the trees offered greater cover. Then, at around 2 p.m. on January 26, 1945, the attack began. At first came the sound. A deep mechanical rumble emerging from the village through the cold air. Engines. Heavy engines. Moments later, 6 Jagdpanther tank destroyers emerged through the snow near Holzwihr and began advancing directly toward the American positions. Behind them came approximately 250 German infantrymen dressed in white winter camouflage. Moving in skirmish formation beneath heavy artillery support, they spread across the frozen fields with terrifying speed. The German counterattack had arrived. Murphy immediately recognized the danger. Company B possessed almost nothing capable of stopping such armor besides the two M10 tank destroyers supporting them. If the tanks broke through the line, the company could be surrounded and destroyed. Murphy ordered his men to prepare to withdraw while simultaneously directing artillery fire onto the advancing Germans using his field telephone. Then everything began collapsing. Enemy fire struck the rear M10 tank destroyer almost immediately, killing crew members and setting the vehicle ablaze. Thick smoke poured into the freezing air as surviving crewmen abandoned it under intense fire. The second M10 continued fighting stubbornly while reversing toward safer cover near the trees. Murphy later recalled watching American shells strike the frontal armor of the German Jagdpanthers only to ricochet harmlessly away. The German armor kept coming. Then disaster struck again. While attempting to reverse, the remaining M10 slid off the icy roadway into a drainage ditch, leaving its main gun at an unusable angle. Unable to continue fighting, the crew abandoned the vehicle entirely. Suddenly Company B stood alone. No effective anti-tank support. No reinforcements nearby. Hundreds of German infantry advancing behind armored vehicles. Murphy understood instantly that remaining in the forward line meant annihilation. He ordered Company B to retreat toward the secondary defensive positions deeper inside the woods. But Murphy himself stayed behind. Completely alone at the edge of the battlefield. As his men withdrew into the forest, Murphy remained near the road beneath a pine tree calmly directing artillery fire onto the advancing Germans. The scene quickly became surreal. German tanks pushed forward through the snow while infantry spread across both flanks firing machine pistols and rifles. Artillery shells exploded around Murphy's position, shredding branches overhead and blasting frozen dirt into the air. Still he stayed on the telephone. Still he directed artillery. Still he refused to leave. Platoon Sergeant Elmer Brawley later described the sight almost with disbelief. Murphy stood beneath the trees while enemy tanks closed within 50 yards of him. Machine gun fire tore across the battlefield from every direction. Branches exploded around him under shellfire. Yet Murphy continued calmly issuing artillery coordinates as though standing on a training field instead of inside a storm of steel. Soon the Germans realized he was the only visible American remaining in the open. All attention shifted toward him. Bullets ripped through the snow around his position. Tank shells crashed nearby. Explosions shook the frozen ground. Murphy continued fighting until his carbine ammunition was exhausted. Then he made the decision that would define his life forever. Behind him sat the burning M10 tank destroyer abandoned earlier in the battle. Flames spread through the damaged vehicle while ammunition inside threatened to detonate at any moment. Most men would have run from it. Murphy climbed onto it. He scrambled onto the burning vehicle and grabbed hold of its exposed .50 caliber machine gun. Lieutenant Walter Fanning, an artillery observer nearby, later said it was the bravest thing he had ever witnessed in combat. Completely exposed against the snow-covered battlefield, Murphy opened fire directly into the advancing German infantry. The heavy machine gun roared across the frozen fields. .50 caliber rounds tore through enemy formations. German soldiers dropped instantly while others threw themselves into the snow searching desperately for cover. The battlefield erupted into chaos. Bullets slammed into the burning tank destroyer from every direction. Smoke wrapped around Murphy while flames flickered beneath him. Enemy tank shells exploded nearby, shaking the vehicle violently. At any second the ammunition inside the M10 could ignite and kill him instantly. Murphy stayed anyway. For nearly an hour, he fought almost entirely alone. Again and again German infantry attempted to advance only to be driven back by devastating machine gun fire and artillery strikes Murphy coordinated over the field telephone. At times he fired continuously. At others he paused only long enough to direct artillery onto enemy concentrations moving through the fields. German tanks halted uncertainly in the open terrain, unable to safely advance into the woods while Murphy continued pouring fire into their infantry support. Twice enemy tank shells slammed directly into the burning M10. Both times Murphy disappeared inside clouds of smoke and debris. Both times he emerged alive and resumed firing. Then came one of the closest moments of the battle. Peering through smoke drifting across the battlefield, Murphy suddenly spotted movement only yards away. A group of 12 German soldiers had crawled through a ditch and were preparing to rush the tank destroyer at close range. If they reached him, the fight was over. Murphy swung the .50 caliber machine gun toward them and fired from nearly point-blank distance. The attack collapsed instantly. Every German soldier in the group went down before reaching the vehicle. But Murphy's situation remained desperate. His leg wound, previously suffered during earlier combat, had reopened during the battle. Blood soaked through his clothing while artillery fragments and bullets tore around him. Still he continued fighting. At one point, while calling for additional artillery support, the radio operator reportedly asked Murphy how close the Germans were. Murphy answered with the now legendary line, "Just hold the phone and I'll let you talk to one of the bastards." Then he ordered artillery fire directly onto his own position. Moments later American shells exploded around the burning M10 itself. Steel fragments slammed against the vehicle while German machine gun fire ripped through the smoke-filled battlefield. Murphy remained on top of the tank destroyer. Still firing. Still directing artillery. Still refusing to retreat. Finally, after more than an hour of combat against one seemingly unstoppable defender, the German assault began losing momentum. The infantry attack stalled. The tanks hesitated. German soldiers who moments earlier surged confidently across the fields now hugged the frozen ground trying to survive the devastating fire raining onto them. Private First Class Abramsky later recalled watching the battle from deeper inside the American lines in complete disbelief. When Murphy finally exhausted his ammunition, he painfully climbed down from the burning tank destroyer and staggered back toward Company B. But even then he was not finished. Despite his wounds, Murphy reorganized the surviving men and immediately led a counterattack against the weakened Germans. The Americans surged back through the woods and forced the enemy to retreat toward their original positions. Only after the Germans withdrew did Murphy finally allow medics to examine his injuries. Even then he refused evacuation. Later estimates suggested that Murphy's direct fire and artillery coordination killed or wounded close to 100 German soldiers during the battle. Murphy himself later recalled that only minutes after he left the burning M10, its ammunition detonated violently. Had he remained there any longer, he almost certainly would have died. Military officers later concluded that Murphy's actions prevented Company B from being surrounded and destroyed entirely. The battle near Holzwihr instantly became legendary. Reports describing Murphy's unbelievable stand spread rapidly throughout Allied forces. Veteran soldiers who heard the story often struggled to believe it actually happened. But it had. And soon the United States Army formally recognized it. On June 2, 1945, near Salzburg, Austria, Audie Murphy received the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States. The shy young Texan who once looked too small for military service now stood recognized as the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War. During the ceremony, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch reportedly leaned toward Murphy and quietly whispered, "I wonder if you're as nervous as I am." Murphy replied softly, "Yes, sir. I think I am." By the end of the war, Murphy's list of awards had become staggering. The Medal of Honor. The Distinguished Service Cross. 2 Silver Stars. The Bronze Star with Valor. 3 Purple Hearts. French decorations. Belgian decorations. Campaign medals. Combat badges. And countless stories from men who survived because of him. When Murphy returned home to America in August 1945, he became an instant national celebrity. Newspapers published his photographs across the country. Crowds gathered to see him. Hollywood producers quickly recognized his popularity and soon offered him movie roles. Murphy eventually appeared in more than 40 films, most of them westerns. But perhaps his most famous performance came in 1955 when he portrayed himself in the film adaptation of his autobiography, To Hell and Back. Yet despite fame, money, and recognition, the war never truly released him. Like many veterans of World War II, Murphy carried invisible wounds that few people understood at the time. He suffered severe nightmares. He battled insomnia, anxiety, and addiction. Friends later revealed that Murphy often slept with a loaded pistol beneath his pillow because he could never fully escape the feeling that danger might appear at any moment. What modern generations would recognize as PTSD haunted him for the remainder of his life. Still, Murphy dedicated enormous energy toward helping fellow veterans struggling after the war. He openly discussed the emotional damage combat inflicted on soldiers at a time when very few public figures dared to speak about such things. Years later, during a Veterans Day interview, Murphy was asked what moment from the war remained most memorable to him. His answer surprised many people. It was not the Medal of Honor. Not the battle at Holtzwihr. Not fame or recognition. Murphy quietly explained that the most unforgettable moment came while traveling on a train toward the Riviera for a short period of rest when he heard the announcement that the war in Europe had finally ended. Nothing else compared to that feeling. After years of violence, exhaustion, fear, and watching friends disappear forever, the war was finally over. Then, on May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy boarded a twin-engine Aero Commander aircraft departing from DeKalb Airport in Atlanta, Georgia. 5 others were aboard. The plane was headed toward Martinsville, Virginia. It never arrived. Flying through poor weather conditions, the aircraft crashed into a mountainside, killing everyone on board instantly. Audie Leon Murphy was only 45 years old. On June 7, 1971, he was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Yet even in death, Murphy wanted simplicity. At his own request, the special gold lettering traditionally reserved for Medal of Honor recipients was omitted from his gravestone. No grand tribute. No elaborate inscription. No special recognition separating him from the men he fought beside. Only a simple marker. The grave of a soldier. And somewhere near the frozen fields outside Holtzwihr, where smoke once drifted across the snow and machine guns echoed through the winter air, the memory of that impossible stand still remains. A lone figure standing atop a burning tank destroyer. Surrounded by enemy fire. Refusing to retreat. Refusing to surrender. Fighting alone against an army.